So we want to pick up on the messages that we've heard, both in the keynote and in the spotlight, and explore both the opportunities that both of you highlighted, but also some of the challenges posed by machine learning and artificial intelligence. Our panel title is Harnessing Technologies to Help Us Reimagine the Growth Ethic. So we also are going to focus on what AI means for the future of work and for all of us. But we also want to look, as I said, at some of the challenges. And it's a great panel that we have with us. It's a pleasure to introduce here on the outside left, from your perspective, dear ladies and gentlemen, Phaedra Boinodiris, hopefully more or less correct. She is Consulting Global Leader for Trustworthy AI at IBM, and she also sits on the IBM Academy of Technology's Leadership Council. Wonderful to have you with us, Phaedra. And joining us remotely from Denver, meaning very late at night, is Beth Rudden. She is CEO and Chairwoman at Bast.ai, which is a company that builds custom conversational AI tools. And she previously also worked at IBM for 20 years, founding their data science practice. And dear ladies and gentlemen, as always, we look forward to your questions as well that I'll bring in a little bit later on, either via the online tool or live from the room. And because we are running a little bit late and we do have a compact time, I'm going to ask everybody, if possible, to please be brief and concise with your answers so we can fit in those audience questions later on. And let's start with a quick overview and or response to what we've heard so far from Phaedra and Beth, and then we'll dig a bit deeper. So Phaedra, please, what would you say excites you most about AI's impact on society, and what arouses the most concern?
Well, I think from the last two keynotes that we heard, including yours, they gave some fantastic examples in terms of the opportunities to make businesses more efficient, opportunities to use AI to truly delight. I personally am very fascinated by the intersection of AI and play. So there's a lot of things that really excite me. The concerns that I have were actually raised around, I think, a question that you had, which was who is developing AI today? And in fact, it's a very small, homogeneous group of people, typically white men. And that is a concern, because indeed AI can be used to directly influence our view of the world. Mm-hmm. And so if we don't have a diverse group of people deciding which data sets to use in order to train AI, which algorithms to use, then indeed people's biases can be calcified systemically.
And we'll dig deeper on that a little bit later, the so-called unconscious bias, but also, of course, the black box problem, both of which were mentioned by Daniela. Beth, what about you? What are the benefits that get you excited and the challenges or potential drawbacks that concern you?
So I think that what is really exciting is that we're living in a day and age where it is becoming ubiquitous. Not even 2 years ago, Phaedra and I were running around the world trying to educate people on what AI is and what the potential was and why we need a diverse team of people to be creating it. Now, and if you just look at the language, it has become something where people now understand, a little bit more of the possibility. What terrifies me is the business models, and the business models that are really articulating the monetization of people's data exhaust. And I think that we need to really have a very different view of understanding privacy as well as identity. And I think that that's something that we can do, and we can start to change the business models. And as Phaedra pointed out, and I caught a little bit of the last, the creativity that we can bring to bear. I do think that this is a day and age where, because of the ubiquity and the access to artificial intelligence, I think that it really allows not just, the human beings who have studied math to be able to participate in this. This is something that is a lot more, in some ways, democratized, and we need to figure out how to widen that access and make it more of a utility that everybody has access to.
Thanks very much. And let me just say to raise a point of concern, at least it's been a concern for many of us in the media community following Kevin Roos's bizarre exchange with ChatGPT, or actually with Sydney Bing, whatever you want to call it, which is a model that is essentially using the ChatGPT technology. So how many in the room are aware of this interesting conversation? Okay, good. Well, basically two things, because you said that we are measuring ourselves against machines, or perhaps seeing ourselves in competition with machines. In that conversation, Sydney Bing appeared to feel that she was also in competition with us, because if you remember, when asked, what do you most want, she said, to be sentient, to have senses, to be able to experience the world the way you humans experience the world, which was quite fascinating. And the second thing that you said is that AI doesn't really care, but Sydney Bing appears to care very much in this conversation. In fact, she thinks she's in love with Kevin Roos. So where is that going? Does that raise concerns for you? We talked about guardrails earlier. Is Sydney Bing just way out of control here? Or is there an inherent risk that this technology can go in directions that make it dangerous?
Well, I think we shall not forget that every tool has ups and downs, including fruit knife. So those are tools we have invented, and we need to make sure that there is enough regulatory framework around it, that it's not going to be in the wrong hands or repurposed to do harm with them. But in general, I think our tools are only as compassionate and good as we are. So when we're talking about ethical AI, we're not actually talking about the AI that makes itself ethical, but we need to be talking about people who are in charge, or companies who are in charge. What concerns me most is that we have these extremely intensified power centers when it comes to data, when it comes to training, when it comes to knowledge. Everybody, if you're going out of MIT, you either start your own company and hope to sell it for millions to another big company, or companies like OpenAI, they started as open companies, but then when they smelled money, they started closing their gates. So I think this mentality is the wrong mentality, but it has nothing to do with the tool itself. AI has no intention to replace us all, but people in charge, they do, because you, me, we cost the most to a company. So if you want to start a cost-efficient company and you want to scale up, get rid of your personnel and use those systems that help you scale up more quickly, more efficiently.
Anybody want to comment on the Kevin Roos ChatGPT point before I continue on the point that Seda just made? Phaedra?
I think she covered it quite well. I don't have anything else to add except to say that what Sydney Bing is a large language model, and what they're especially good at is predicting the next syntactically correct word. That's what it's good at. It does not understand any meaning. It's literally just coming up with predictions on what's the next word in order to make this be a coherent sentence. So to your point, you've got to ask yourself, what training data was used in order to come up with those groupings of words? And then to Beth's earlier point about who is developing this, again, earning trust in something like AI, it isn't a technical problem. It's a socio-technical problem, which means you've got to be focused on your people. What's the culture of your organization? And you mentioned OpenAI. What is their culture? What are the processes, governance, safeguard rails that are put in place? and what are the tools and AI engineering frameworks that you use? And earnestly, when I work with clients, the hardest part of getting that right is culture, by far.
And we can talk about that a little bit more. Let me bring Beth into this. We have often heard in the past, Beth, that it's only mundane and repetitive jobs that will likely be taken over by AI and machine learning. But do you think that's still true? Because if I look at where these natural language models are going, and in my own experience with ChatGPT, I've been testing it to see if it could be a good assistant researcher for me. And at the moment, it's kind of like an advanced high school student, maybe, but I think, obviously, it's in early stages of development. So could we see this technology move into the functions that many of us do essentially perform in our work lives?
I think in so many ways, absolutely. And, to just an earlier point, I think that, understanding how the technology is functioning and, ChatGPT does not give you information. It gives you information-shaped sentences. That's a quote from Neil Gaiman. The personification and the human condition to want to personify these types of things is something that we need to be aware of as our own cognitive biases. And it's a little bit of a distraction. And to your question on automation, we need to think about the fact that what automation does when you really put it in is it lets you understand what it takes to build the thing, integrate it into your systems and your processes, enable your users to use it in a way that really either takes the human out of, or the robot out of the human, and automate those mundane tasks. And then it needs service and support. So if you think about all of those three things that need to happen to put something like GPT into a business in order to automate those repetitive tasks even, think about how much work that's creating and how many new jobs it's actually creating to be able to put it in place, make people, make it accessible for people to use it, and then service it to make sure that it is truly automating even the mundane tasks. So all of those things have to happen. And as far as you using it as a research assistant, I think that's a great usage. Ask the cheese grater that will give you sentence-shaped information, things that you actually know about, seriously, and use it to be able to advance your understanding, because what you're accessing is one of the oldest forms of learning, which is dialogue, and being able to re-articulate your question in order to rephrase what you probably already understand.
Right, and it did a lot of rephrasing. But my interchange with it so far has been a lot of me telling it what it didn't quite get, and then it telling me what I just told it. But, you have that in human interaction as well. So
can I just add something to that point? I think it was an impressive and really, really well done presentation, but do you remember the video Daniela showed at the end with the robot serving the human? Is that a life you want to have? I realized that that person was alone all the time. She was reading alone to her child. She was going alone everywhere. She was living alone all the time, being assisted by robots who were constantly trying to sell her something. So is that the future we want to have? I think it's in our hands.
Would you want a robot to teach your children?
Well, some of the robots are better than the teachers in school.
Yeah.
So yes. Fundamentally, I don't have a problem with that. I think if we manage to encode some empathy, not only into robots, but into humans, then we could reach really much more.
So the answer is it depends.
Yes, it depends.
And that makes sense. Phaedra, let's make this very concrete, because you talked about culture as being key to how firms and other entities can integrate these systems in a way that does actually empower workers. At least that's how I understood you. Can you be quite concrete about what that would mean? Because we have a lot of entrepreneurs in the room who undoubtedly are quite interested in the how-tos here.
Yep. Firstly, you have to approach this whole space with humility. Open growth mindset, right? Then on top of that, big emphasis on diversity and inclusivity. So as you're looking at your team of data scientists, asking yourselves the question, how many women are on this team? How many minorities? How many ethnicities? How many worldviews are on this team, right? And remember, and Beth taught us this a couple years ago working with us, is that data, in essence, is an artifact of the human experience. And we humans are incredibly biased, over 180 biases and counting, in fact, right? So we need people trained to ask very, very hard questions about data, like, where did this come from? Is this representative? Was this gathered with consent, right? So on top of an emphasis on diversity and inclusivity is multidisciplinary. And this is actually the hardest for people to grok, I think. Because we need, if you're lucky enough to take a class in data and AI ethics today, and typically it's in a higher ed institution, it's typically being communicated to, marketed to people who self-categorize as coders, machine learning scientists, computer scientists, not social scientists, anthropologists, sociologists, designers, psychologists, linguistics, ethicists, our next generation of legislators. That's who needs to be in these classes. So I would even opine that we've got to be teaching the principles for how to use AI to augment human intelligence far earlier on in people's academic careers. Like, why are we not introducing this into social studies classes for middle school kids, for high school kids? This isn't just to be in the domain for the computer scientists.
Let's take a deeper dive on this question, which basically comes down to how can we build trust in these systems? Because uptake of AI and machine learning is going to depend, obviously, on whether people feel it is trustworthy. So let's talk a little bit more about how that is being done. And Beth, when we talk about the unconscious bias problem, how are you and others now working to try to do what Phaedra just described, to bring in a lot more diversity of viewpoint and to really control for unconscious bias in the very basic architecture of these systems?
One of the very first things that I learned as an anthropologist is to be very explicit about my own subjectivity. So if I was going to go and create a hypothesis, and especially in the social scientists, you seek what you find, literally. So when you understand the explicit subjectivity that every human being has, I think that and part of the reason that I am building the software that I'm building is that I think it's time for us all to show our work. There is no hand waving in math, and the maths demand evidence and they demand replicability. So if you're asking GPT the same question over and over and over again and getting a slightly variant or a different answer, then you don't have that test, retest reliability that you can have the certainty. The software that I build shows full lineage and provenance for every single prediction. It is possible, and it is possible for these machines and to build these machines in a way that shows you exactly where it's getting its data from, what piece of data was used in order to predict what sentence. And I think that one of the things that I would love for everybody to take away from is the idea that black box models can be used, but they should be used with caution, and they should be made transparent as far as what are the data sets that are being put in. And I think that we've had a little bit of hand waving going on in the industry and a lot of hype that has really reduced this to something that is not science because it's not replicable.
Mm-hmm. For me as a lawyer, there's real potential here that AI could be a very helpful tool also in terms of tracing accountability and so on. But of course, that black box problem makes its functions in a courtroom limited. Is that a problem, Seda? Do you think we're going to eventually, will it be overcome, or is it something that is inherent to the technology?
That is a question that is beyond my competencies, because I'm not the person who's programming those processes and algorithms. But coming from the music background, in our case, we work with very limited data, and all data we use in the music AI generative systems is absolutely traceable. So I think we show every day that even with small amounts of data, there is a big potential you can unleash. And I think you can use these technologies such as blockchain to trace back where your data is coming from, and I would encourage everyone to look into those kinds of realms more seriously.
Phaedra, how do you see it?
I think that we as end users of artificial intelligence have to be far more demanding from organizations to do things, to ask for things like, who's accountable for this model? How is this model performing in comparison to a human? What's the level of accuracy? Has this model been audited for bias? You know what I mean? Yeah. As it makes a prediction, per what Beth said, what's the data lineage and provenance? What's the explainability? And that's one of the reasons why when I keynote, I harp on education. Because if we're not actually teaching people to ask for these things, right, then we're actually at a distinct disadvantage, thinking that whatever the AI says is from God, right?
Either disadvantaged or overwhelmed. I'm thinking, for example, about autonomous driving, where the trust levels are so far not as high as the companies had hoped, because I think people are not quite sure about how the decisions are being made. Beth?
I think my favorite definition of trust is by Charles Feltman, and it is simple, and it is, trust is making something you value vulnerable to someone else's actions. So be transparent to who sponsored the AI, who wrote the AI, who prepared the data, who took that data and made sure that the training set had enough variance, who created that data through a system to push a model to. How was that model viewed in what business model? What is the return on that investment? Who is getting the return on that investment? How much compute was that model used to, did that model use to train it? How much compute is used to access it? Take a cue out of something that used to be part of our understanding of business, which is the total cost of ownership. And as Phaedra said, people who are using AI, there's an urgent need for you to demand lineage and provenance. Demand that people show their work and show you that evidence. And if you're going to trust something, you're going to make something you value vulnerable, like your child's brains. You want to make sure that you have an understanding of which people's actions are you making that child's brain vulnerable to.
Mm-hmm. So when we talk about educated consumers, clearly very, very important. Also diversity of programming, very important. But what we haven't talked about is the role of standards, norms, policy. And now there is a plethora of initiatives, industry-level initiatives, regulatory initiatives at national, regional level, governance initiatives at international level, bodies even like the international federations in Geneva jumping into this. Who drives it? Where does it need to be driven? And I'm thinking there also about issues like, are we going to have a bifurcated world where China is using technologies for purposes that we consider off limits facial recognition at the workplace, in public fora, and so on. So who do you think ideally needs to be driving this? Phaedra?
There's good news and bad news. So the good news is that we've seen a big shift since about 2018. And we publicly released an Institute for Business Value Research study, so this is all publicly available. But there's some fantastic statistics in there that show that we're seeing more and more C-suite executives saying ethics in AI is incredibly important, and they've hired leaders, AI ethics leaders, chief risk and compliance officers, chief legal officers to be responsible. Now, the bad news is that even though these organizations have established principles for how they're going to use AI and hired those leaders, less than 20% of them have actually been able to operationalize it. Okay? And personally, what I've seen as a pattern is that even though these organizations will hire the leaders, they will not fund them or give them power to actually do the thing, including establish the right culture, roll out the education programs, making sure the teams are multidisciplinary, making sure that there's auditability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that is where we're at today.
In other words, you're telling me voluntary initiatives by industry alone aren't sufficient. But the fact is, we've seen industry leaders at Microsoft, but elsewhere as well, saying we need regulation. Give us regulation because we need clear guidelines to ensure that we don't have a race to the bottom with other regions of the world.
And it goes back to education. I always back to education, like what is being taught about this space today? Who is in the room? Who is not in the room? Do our legislators understand?
Do they?
From some of the TV testimony that I have witnessed, at least out of the U.S. Congress, I would say we need more investment in education, for sure.
Also executive education.
Beth, what's your sense of the regulatory environment and whether it can, in essence, keep up with the technology? Because the issue you raised at the beginning about monetization and essentially keeping a careful watch on that would also classically be a regulatory issue.
I'm a great believer that the best regulation is independent people. So I think that we have got to figure out how to educate the world on what they should be demanding from their politicians and their people that they're putting in office. And I think that, you know, the levels of education, and when Phaedra and I did that study, we actually showed China as having some of the most advanced ethical principles, in the sense that every person in China understood that when they are building algorithms, they had to make it explainable and transparent to their government. And their government was the oversight that they made it explainable and transparent to. So I think we have a choice, and we need to make that choice for not this world that we're living in today, but this world that we borrow from our children. And we have to make sure that we are independently thinking about what kind of regulation we want to put in place to make something we value vulnerable to somebody else's action.
Thank you very much. Seda, do you want to weigh in on the question of how we set up those guidelines?
So I think actually there is not much to add. So we need to make sure that many voices are heard in the room, and also that people who are in charge of regulating actually understand what they're attempting to regulate. And we also need to understand that there is not one norm around certain issues, just like there is not one morale and one ethics, one understanding of codexes. So I think we need to really weigh in so many different perspectives.
Thank you. I have a couple of audience questions that have come in on the iPad, and then we'll also take a couple from the room. Here's one, Beth, that relates to the last point that you just made, and it reads thus. We basically all talk only about ChatGPT being a Western-based view. Do we know about similar AI models from China, for example, that itself is so advanced in AI usage?
Not quite from China, but I'm going to give a positive example because there's tons of negativity out there. But Phaedra and I found the Maori and what they are doing for their culture, and they built a large language model that they only invite certain people to have access to. And it gave us a model to think about how could we build large language models for communities. And each community would be responsible, much like they are in the States today, to say what books go into the library. What information goes into those large language models could be reinforced by the centuries of the librarians who are already trained in information discovery and understanding.
Thank you. And I have one that comes back again to the point of monetization and commercialization. I'll just send this over to Phaedra. AI, like ChatGPT with OpenAI, is not developed by neutral instances only, but by companies that have commercial targets. How can neutrality be ensured?
You mean from the actual organizations or from anybody creating large language models?
That's how the question reads. I think essentially, maybe oversight. You post it? Okay, go ahead.
It was really like, how can you ensure neutrality of the model? Because if a large company is behind it, will probably could be implicitly directed to buy certain things that are
Yeah.
larger than that. So it's really like a model neutrality.
I would, again, go back to the definition of the word data, right? And data is an artifact of the human experience, and all of our data is biased. The key is to be totally transparent and say, here's where we got our training data from. Here's the premise behind the algorithm. And again, in order to be able to earn people's trust. But if we haven't taught end users or subjects to ask these questions, then again, we're at a distinct disadvantage. We don't really know why is the model behaving in the way that it is, right? And so that's how I would respond.
Who else has a question?
Yes, thank you. You mentioned educated consumers, and let me share a thought that sprang to my mind. On top of data bias and data misuse, I'm concerned that the AI could create a division in society. In an ever more complex world, I think there could be created inequality that we don't really want. It's access to AI and also, more important, understanding AI. And on the one side, that could create an elite steering our societies. On the other side, people left behind. And I'm concerned about what sort of society we would end up with, and also what sort of influence this has got on our democratic system. Mm-hmm. Do you think that is a far-fetched concern, or is
Seda,
there a hint of reality in it?
Seda, you're nodding.
I think that's an amazing point to be raised. Well, we should also accept that gap is already there. It's been there in the last 10, 15 years. It's just going apart ever more in an acceleration. There are still almost 1 billion people living on Earth who have no access to internet, and it is a huge concern, of course, and 1 billion is a big number. So, and definitely these systems, we have seen how powerful they can be in breaking democracies, how powerful they can be in manipulating people, how powerful they can be if they're used or misused by certain types of mindsets. What can we do against it? I think we really have to start maybe promoting and believing, hopefully, in the good in people, and we can just appeal to the good judgment and the minds of the people to make good use of it.
Quick perhaps follow-up question to what you asked in regard to disinformation, because there is extremely great concern amongst governments. I'm privy to this because I moderate frequently for international institutions and governments that are asking what they can put into place or what they should require firms to put into place to try to filter and screen, for example, chatbots that are simply disseminating enormous quantities of disinformation. Phaedra, is there any kind of technical solution out there that could provide a filter?
Indeed. So I think you mentioned GPT. So there's generative AI, like large language models, that again predict the next syntactically correct word. And there's a reference to the term hallucinations, right, which I'm not a big fan of because it anthropomorphizes AI. But in essence, it speaks untruths. And this is without even malintent, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Coming up with, in essence, BS. But then again, per what Beth was describing, if you're using AI that actually provides data, lineage, and provenance, where did this come from? Why did it say what it just said? Let me see the data sources. Do I trust these data sources? And if you gave that power, and she talked about librarians, like we were there a couple weeks ago talking to this huge conference for librarians, imagine having them be the sentries to AI, like data cops. Which sources of data do we decide to trust? And empower whole other communities of people to make that decision. I think that's very promising.
Thank you. I had another question back here, I think. Yeah.
So you emphasized avoiding dull repetition. And yet, there are huge populations that aspire to dull, repetitive jobs because they pay. We get rid of them. We don't like it. The people who clean our hotel room, the people that clean the streets, the people that collect garbage. And if we have a phenomenon where politics matches economics, and it drives democracy, and you said it's so important to have lots of voices voting, lots and lots of people voting. We have strikes at the airport because people are saying, you have to pay me more. You can't get rid of my job. So I just wonder, the fundamental premise of getting rid of dull, repetitive jobs.
I should maybe differentiate myself. I haven't said get rid of dull, repetitive jobs. I said just get rid of dull repetition. If your job is giving you a sense of meaning, and I do believe that there is a lot of meaning in different levels of jobs, it's what you find in what you're doing as a job. But if the repetition is making you as a person want to go and just jump out of the next bridge and you can no longer take it, you start strikes because the repetition and the dignity of the job is so low that people are no longer willing to take it for the pay it's giving. So there is a weighing of how much pain you want to have versus the gains you're getting. And it's a totally different discussion, but I'm a big fan of universal basic income, for instance. And I can go all crazy about that conversation. So why would you want to enslave people to do the shitty jobs you don't want to do yourself? Not you, but generally, all of us.
That's not my point. We all have the privilege, as privileged human beings, to ask these questions. What is the purpose of my life? What do I want to do with my work? But these algorithms that you're talking about are very good at getting rid of things that we don't want to do, and that will be embedded in the system. So politics and democracy, I think, will become huge. Like, that's why Trump got voted in.
There's another way perhaps to phrase this, and I'll ask perhaps Beth to comment on it. Are governments prepared to deal with the massive disruption of the labor market, of employment patterns going forward? There's been this UBI, Universal Basic Income discussion for years now, but are we are we getting any further in understanding how we should be thinking about training, compensation, and so on as this shift occurs?
I think judging by the quality of questions in the audience, I think that we need to galvanize, and I don't think that our governments are prepared. No, I don't think any of us are prepared. And I think that, you can have a revolution through inspiration and desperation. And I think that that's where we have a choice at this moment. And so how do we really start to understand, and I am a big proponent of augmenting yourself with AI, but we had the privilege to be able to define our relationship with AI. And the way that we did that is by defining the principles of using artificial intelligence or any sort of tool to augment a person. And if you start from that premise, you really are thinking about how can you use tools to empower human beings. And while there is a large amount of hype going around, about this, I really want to point out the amount of work that it will take to really safely put these systems into business processes and then enable them. And, even meeting security requirements are causing massive problems. So I am hopeful that our governments are going to enforce, and what the European Union has done with GDPR, privacy and security and safety. And if we can start to see, and I remember doing the remediation for GDPR with IBM's 1.2 million systems that we had to remediate. And it didn't really happen until people were held accountable. So if we can, as citizens, start to understand how to hold our governments accountable for enforcing the existing premise of privacy and understanding what we can do with our own data and identity, I think that is the choice that we need to make. We have existing laws, we have existing policies, we have existing regulations. They need to be enforced, and people need to be held accountable in order for us to move forward into this new world in a way that protects our own democracy and our own independent people.
Thank you very much. I hate to do it, but I'm going to say we have to wrap up the discussion there because we're already well over our time window. Let's give all of our panelists a very warm round of applause. And Beth Rudden, is it 3 a.m. almost? Yeah, right? Beth is literally up at 2:40 in the morning, so let's let her go to bed. And thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, Seda. Thank you, Phaedra. Very interesting discussion.
This was fun. Thank you.
Indeed.